everyone again. Two subjects that evaluators rarely touch on are the content or the topic of your speech and personal style. So I'm going to take those two subjects tonight. And to illustrate these subjects, I'm using somebody called Dave Allen. How many of you know who Dave Allen was? Some of you. I guess a lot of you wouldn't know. He's been dead about 10 years now. He was my favourite television comic and raconteur, which is what most of us do, learning how to tell stories. I've chosen him because we are encouraged at Toastmasters not to talk about sex, politics and religion. And for those of you who can remember Dave Allen, that's all he ever spoke about. And I'm going to explain, you can talk about these things, it's just how you do it. I've also chosen him because he broke every rule we've ever been taught. And the longer you're at Toastmasters, the more rules that keep coming up. You know, don't look down at the floor, don't look at the ceiling, don't fidget, don't stand in one place. It goes on and on and on and on. And I'm going to suggest to you that you go onto the internet and try and see Dave Allen in action so you can see what I'm talking about. Watch him break every single rule you've ever been taught. Work out why he gets away with it. And just see if perhaps breaking one or two, bending one or two of those rules, I call it bend it like Dave, might help you develop your own personal style. So I'll start back with three subjects he spoke about. There are some rules, and when you join a club, of course you have to know the rules. They're there for a good reason. They work. So how come he got away with it? Well, I'll take religion first. The rough rule of thumb with religion and politics is we don't want to be preached at. We don't want you to proselytize. But there are many ways we can talk about this subject. As far as religion goes, the rough rule is if you're going to send a religion up, you have to be a member of that particular club. That's roughly how it goes. As far as sex goes, of course you can talk about sex. Just don't go down the stand-up comedy route. I recently went to a comedy club run by an ex-member of one of these clubs, just to see how much heavier it was than here, and believe me, it's a totally different ballgame. You can't do that sort of stuff. Yeah. So you don't do that, you don't do the juvenile stuff, you don't offend anybody, and you don't do the scatological stuff. That's the new jokes. As long as you keep it grown up, informative, entertaining, unusual angle, of course you can do sex. So that's enough about topics. I hope that opens the field up for a lot of you who find it difficult to think of something to talk about, because one of those things just might be your thing. So, what did he do? In a minute, I'm going to get up on here, if I can without falling off. It's quite tricky, it's quite hard for me. And I need this prop. So, what did he do that we're taught not to do? Well, for a start, he sat on a stool like this, he crossed his legs, and he slouched. And he didn't move, he didn't walk around the stage, he just slouched for the whole hour, however long he was up there. And nobody minded, it was brilliant. He also did pauses about 10 times longer than the pauses we're allowed to do. And he did this by looking at the floor. And at the walls. And at the ceiling. And we all just thought it was so brilliant. And he smoked. Whenever he wanted a long pause, he would smoke and blow out the cigarettes, and then he'd have a drink. I mean, you can smoke during a speech if you want. If you find one of those blue jobbies, you know, those electric things. If it's essential for your speech, of course you can do it. And you can drink champagne. I've given speeches drinking champagne, so if you have to, of course you can. What else did he do? He groomed. He incessantly groomed. He fiddled with his ring, he groomed his hair, he picked off imaginary bits of lint off his dinner jacket constantly. He did it to buy time. He did it to create a long pause. And then he came up with an amazing punchline. And it worked every single time. I'm going to get down from this, I might get back up. But I'm going to now illustrate with a story all the things he did, just so that you can see it in action. Now I'm going to take another chance here and do something I shouldn't do, break the rules again. I'm going to tell you a story that you might know. I'm hoping you don't all read the Sunday papers, because it's a very recent story. I'm hoping you don't. So, in the guise of Dave Allen, and I can't do the Irish accent or the sexy charm, I'm afraid, but I'll try and do the rest. And the story is about a man called Jeremy Clark. Don't know if you know who he is. Not Jeremy Clarkson. His predecessors are people like John Diamond, who died of cancer, and Melanie Reid, who has a spinal injury. She's a quadriplegic. And they all write diaries in the Times about their lives, which is pretty gruesome. But Jeremy Clark manages to make his having testicular cancer and going for chemotherapy every week into a sort of running saga of fun. And this is again to try and open up the sorts of things you can talk about. You can talk about sex, you can talk about death, you can talk about cancer. And that's what he did. This week, he talked about going to a phlebotomy clinic. That's where you go to give blood. Now, because he might not live forever and he's only in his 40s, he's got to find a way of enjoying going to this clinic. And he does. I mean, the nurses are pretty and sexy, and you can't wait for the nurse to come up and stick her needle in his arm. He's found a way of finding pleasure in that, believe me. Anyway, last week when she came along, he was all excited because she was going to stick her needle in his arm. And her mobile phone went off, and she disappeared. I didn't even know nurses were allowed mobile phones while they were on duty. Anyway, she disappeared and did a day out of pause. God, where's she gone? He was so excited and looking forward to this. And then he looks round and he sees a woman on the gurney next to him. And he does a double take and thinks, oh my God, I know her. And he starts chatting her up, and she looks at him. She doesn't know who he is. I mean, he's famous, but he's not that famous. But she has a good reason to remember who he is. And he's thinking, she doesn't remember who I am. And then he tells us why she should remember who he is. About 5 years previously, he had a friend who confided in him one night. He came up to Jeremy and said, I want to ask you the most enormous favour. So Jeremy said, okay. So he confided in him, and he told him, for the last 5 years, every Wednesday night, he'd taken his wife to bingo, and then he'd got in his car and gone off to pick this other woman up. I don't know what she told her husband where she was going that night, but he took her to a beautiful beauty spot in the woods in his car, and he kissed and cuddled her for an hour. And then he took her back home to her husband, and he went and picked up his wife. And Jeremy is thinking, oh my God, what's he going to ask me to do? And this chap, Jim, says, I've got to have a hip operation. I'm going to be out of action for months. Will you please pick this woman up, take my wife to bingo, and kiss and cuddle her in this beauty spot? I'll tell you where it is. And Jeremy is thinking, no way! I would kiss and cuddle a woman I don't even know for an hour, just so you don't lose your place in the queue. And he says no. And the chap bursts into tears and said, Jeremy, you don't understand how important this is to me. This woman just saves my marriage, she saves my life. I look forward to this kissing and cuddling so much. And if you don't do it, she's so pretty, she'll find somebody else and I'll lose my place. And I'll never find another woman who's free on a Wednesday, who's prepared to go to this beauty spot and let me kiss her in the car. So Jeremy relents, and he agrees to go and kiss and cuddle this woman in the car and sees how it goes. And he's still looking at her and thinking, why doesn't she remember me? And eventually he says, I remember you, Mary. Can you really not remember me? And she looks at him and says, Jeremy, of course I remember you. You were a crummy kisser. And so was I. And she says, he says, well, how's Jim? And she said, oh, he's dead. And she says, and I haven't got much longer either. And he says to her, no, neither have I. And they all burst out laughing. And they seem to think this is hysterical. They're all talking about sex and not sex and everything. And this is how they get through. This is how a lot of people get through this sort of thing. And I'm sure it's keeping a lot of people who've got testicular cancer going, just reading his column. So I'm suggesting to you, go back, watch Dave Allen, see how he breaks the rules. Go and see if breaking those rules can advantage you in your style, and think about subjects that you know something about, you've got a quirky, different angle, something nobody's spoken about before, and take a chance, come up here and tell us about it.